Now that we've introduced the concept of the staff system, the treble and bass clef, and given you a general idea of certain types of modes that were used in the medieval period, as well as the modern modes that are still used by some composers today, we're going to get into Chapter 5, which deals with how to actually identify notes and pitches on the staff system. There are a few important concepts for Chapter 5. First, you need to learn what the difference is between a note and a pitch. There is a difference, and while these terms are often used interchangeably, it's important that you know the correct terminology to use at the correct time. We also talk more about the musical alphabet. While this concept has been introduced, you haven't really been required to learn the musical alphabet yet. Now it's crucial that by the end of this chapter, you fully understand how the musical alphabet works and how it relates to identifying notes of the treble and the bass clef. The next thing we'll talk about is how to actually identify the notes of the treble and the bass clef. For the most part, it's just going to require a lot of work on your part memorizing the way they look on a staff system. This should help your spatial reasoning if this is something you've never done before. And finally, we'll discuss ledger lines. Ledger lines are useful for notes that are really high or really low, the ones that don't fit on the staff system. Because remember, we only have 5 lines and 4 spaces, so we can't put every single note that's possible on a single staff system. So ledger lines solve that problem by allowing us to extend the staff system, which you'll learn about at the appropriate time. So a few terms you need to know. Note. The term note refers only to the notes written on a musical staff. A note doesn't have to produce any sound. So notes are written and not heard. It's what you see on a piece of sheet music. It's the visual representation of sound. So pitch refers to the sound that you actually hear when a note, a visual representation of sound, is played. Pitches can be notated, but the visual representation of a pitch is referred to as a note. So that's an important distinction. The pitch is what you hear, the note is what you see. A note doesn't produce pitch until a musician comes by and plays that note. So ledger line, final term you should know, it's a short line that extends through the middle of a note, and we use them to extend the staff higher or lower. Now the musical alphabet. You should already know this, but it's a circular pattern that starts on A and ends on G. There are 7 letter names that correspond to notes in the musical alphabet. After reaching G, the series begins over again on A. In the diagram on the bottom, you can see how A goes to B, then C, D, E, F, and once it hits G, to go to the next note, you have to start over again on A. Now another concept you really need to understand at this point. It'll make teaching the other concepts much easier if you get this now. The octave is the distance between one note or pitch and its next occurrence. So between A and the next A, either going up or down in pitch, is an octave. Remember that an octave describes a unit of distance, and it specifically refers to the distance from one note to its next repetition. So that means from B to the next B is an octave. Doesn't matter if it goes up or down, ascending or descending, higher or lower. 3 ways of saying the same thing. Another example would be C ascending to the next C. That's an octave. So if you look at your piano keyboard and you play all the C's in consecutive order, you're playing C's in octaves from the lowest to the top note on the actual piano keyboard. So it's important to understand what exactly an octave is, because we're going to be using that term a lot. If you still don't understand it, take a look at your textbook or use some of the online resources to figure out exactly what this concept of the octave is. So the notes of the treble and the bass clef. Very simply, you can use the G line to identify where G falls. You learned that in the previous unit. Now, if you look at this staff system, you have E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. you can figure out all of those notes because you know where G is and you know how to count up and down the musical alphabet. So that's all you have to do to figure out what your note names are. Just memorize one pitch so you can figure out where all the other pitches are in relation to that single pitch. With the bass clef, you use the F line. Those double dots indicate where F falls. And as you can see from the illustration, it's the third to last note in the bass clef diagram. That's the note F. So from there, you just move up to G, then A, or if you want to go down, you go E, D, C, B, A, G, F. So that's how you identify the notes of the treble clef and the bass clef. An additional concept, just so that you understand how movable clef works, and this is not something that either Music 101 or Music 102 students usually have to worry about. But if you continue as a music major, then you will have to understand this concept, so it's important to learn how it works now. So here we have the notes F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G in the alto clef. In the tenor clef, you've got D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E. What this is showing you is that third line in the alto clef is going to be C. In the tenor clef, it's the fourth line. So the middle of the alto clef tells you where middle C is. So what this means is that a note on the third line of the alto clef is going to sound higher than a note on the third line of the tenor clef. And that's a basic concept that you need to understand from here. That when you have a movable clef, it simply changes the note names, which can get confusing, and that's why 101 and 102 students generally don't have to worry about this. It's more important right now you learn your treble and your bass clef. So here's a question for you. Will the fifth line of the alto clef sound higher or lower than the fifth line of the tenor clef? So we have two examples here. The fifth line of the alto clef is a G. The fifth line of the tenor clef is an E. So I'm going to give you a second. Try and figure out which clef is actually going to sound higher if you play the fifth line. Knowing that middle C is in the center of the clef, you can see that the alto clef is actually a third higher than the tenor clef. So if you play a note on the alto clef and it appears the same way on the tenor clef, then the alto note is actually going to be the higher note. So here's an example. We've got middle C across all the clefs. In the treble clef, middle C occurs below the staff. In the alto clef, it occurs in the middle. On the tenor clef, it's on the fourth line, and in the bass clef, middle C occurs above the staff system. If you play any of those notes, they will all be the exact same pitch in the exact same register. We just have different ways of notating it based on the range of the instrument that we need to write for. Now, ledger lines can be placed above or below the staff to extend the staff system. You see here in the bass clef, we have a ledger line that goes straight through that note. In the treble clef, there's also a ledger line that goes straight through that note. All that's doing is extending the staff system so we can play more notes. So here is an image of those ledger lines without the notes on them. As you can see, in a way, it's sort of an extension of the staff system. You just break up the bar line to show that it's separate from the initial 5 lines and 4 spaces of the basic staff system. So all you do is you can place notes on, above, or below these lines to indicate pitch. And you can have as many lines as you need to. Here's an example of how ledger lines might work in practice. In the treble clef, you've got the notes A, B, C, D, and then above the staff, G, A, B, C. You see how you just add a ledger line with each new note to go lower or higher? The reason we use ledger lines, and we don't just have a staff with more lines in it, is because if you look at this example here, if you didn't have the lower example, if you didn't have ledger lines, then this bottom example would actually be much harder to read. The first example with ledger lines and the second one where I have just created 11 staff lines, those are actually the same exact notes. The only difference is we didn't break up the ledger lines to create individual ledger lines for each note. So what ends up happening is the top line is actually a lot more clear to read than the bottom example. So this just shows you why ledger lines solve a very important problem in music, which is how do you write notes above and below the staff while still making it easy for musicians to read. And essentially, this allows you to extend the staff system by 5 ledger lines or more above the staff and still maintain a simple system where musicians, once they get familiar with their notes, can immediately look at these notes and know exactly what their names are and how to play them. So here are some tips for learning note names. You can use an acronym or mnemonic that is easy to remember for recalling the names of the notes. For example, the names of the notes on the spaces of the treble clef may be used to spell the word face. If you look in between the lines, you'll see your face. If you remember the note names for the spaces on the treble clef, you'll see that they actually do spell the word face. So the lines can be turned into an expression, such as elephants get big dirty feet. So elephants is E, the first line. Get is G, the second line. Big is B on the third line. Dirty is D on the fourth line. And feet is F on the fifth line. You can also mentally recall or sing the note names when learning new music. So if you are playing one of the examples in class, you can sing the note names out loud or write them in underneath the notes so that you get used to seeing them and associating them with a written note. You might also want to try spelling words on the staff by using the notes in the treble and bass clef. For example, the middle line, the second space, and the fourth line spell the word bad, B-A-D. So you can actually write 3 notes on the staff system, 1 on the third line, 1 on the second space, and 1 on the fourth line to spell words. This may seem like a silly exercise, but it can actually help you learn the note names. Think of as many words as you can using the musical alphabet and then spell them out on the staff system. It'll get you accustomed to writing notes on the staff, and it will also teach you how to use these note names in a very practical way. You can also find a random piece of sheet music and identify the note names until it's possible to identify the notes on the staff instantly. So go to any of these sites that offer free sheet music or download the information from your workbook and just start randomly identifying notes in the sheet music that is available. There are 7 daily routines, a whole bunch of mirror exercises, there's 12 of them, and plenty of options for you to actually go through and identify these pitches. You need to get really good at identifying pitches. This is the one thing that if you spend time on in this course, you're going to want to spend a lot of time on this, because if you don't know the note names, everything else in this course will become very difficult, if not impossible to complete. You have to learn to identify notes on the staff. It's extremely important. That's why you're learning this already in Unit 2. We have to start right away teaching you the names of the notes. And take those drills online several times until you can just instantly recognize the notes in the treble and the bass clef. Another option, instead of doing the online drills, although you have to do them for your grade, is to create flashcards with a note on one side and a letter name on the other to drill yourself. And you can do this with a friend, family member, anybody that you can rope into helping you. Just make sure you drill yourself on these note names until they are second nature. There's not that many of them, and you should be able to learn these fairly quickly. It just takes time to get used to seeing them on a staff and mentally understanding their positioning between the lines and the spaces. Finally, practice until it becomes possible to identify the names of the notes without having to think about them. If learning the note names is difficult, reduce the number of notes available and memorize 2 or 3 notes at a time. And that is actually a good technique. You can also go to musictheory.net and use their tools to help you identify note names or anything else really in this course.